One day in college, I was sitting with some friends by the river and I started to have a panic attack. This had never happened to me before, so it totally freaked me out. The river was flowing really fast, and one of my friends threw a rock across it, and that's when it happened. My whole body just started shaking, and the sun felt too bright, and I just wanted to scream. After I calmed down, I grabbed my bag and went back to my dorm. I was so embarrassed, and I just needed to be alone for a bit. You see, all I wanted was to fit in. My whole life, I'd been bounced around between foster homes, and only once I reached college did I finally have a room of my own. The first day was really hard, though. Everyone's parents were dropping them off and helping them unpack, and I had no one. I guess you could say I'm an orphan. My mom died giving birth to me, and then my memories go kinda hazy, but there was an accident of some sort, and then I don't remember much. I must have knocked my head really badly because I don't know what happened to my dad. The man who found me after the accident and looked after me said my dad had died in the accident. I was so young at the time, so I didn't really understand. The only thing that sticks in my mind is that we all spoke Spanish together, and we laughed a lot. But the first foster home I was in said that wasn't a real memory, and that my name was Sarah, and I was clearly an English-speaking American. Well, now I was in college studying Spanish as a major, and my professor said I was the best student he'd ever had. I was so good that he came to me one day and said there was a summer program where I could go to Mexico and live with a host family and properly immerse myself in the language and culture. I told him I couldn't afford it, and he said he could arrange a bursary for me. I was so relieved, mainly because I had no plan of where to stay during the vacation time. I definitely wasn't going back to the foster home, and it's not like I had any family to go to. I just hoped the panic attacks stopped before then. Ever since that day at the river, they'd been getting worse and worse. I'd gone to the pool to watch my boyfriend in a swimming competition, and one guy had slipped and fallen in the pool, and I just watched in horror. I could barely breathe, and I think I panicked more than the guy. My boyfriend told me I needed to seriously chill out, and when I told him about the Mexico program, he said I should go for it. I thought he'd be sad that I would be gone for the summer, but he said he'd come visit me near the end and we could travel around together. A few days before I was due to leave, I got really nervous. I'd never traveled anywhere before, but I knew I had to do this. There was another girl, Alana, going with me, but she'd be staying with another host family. When we got there, the director of the program picked us up and drove us to our new homes for the summer. We dropped Alana off first, and I was so glad I wasn't in her position. It looked like her host family were dirt poor. Their house was tiny. I'd already seen photos of where I'd be staying, and it was definitely nicer, even better than some of the foster homes I'd been in. My host parents were waiting for me outside, and when they saw me, they came running over and started hugging me. It was so weird for me. I wasn't used to affection. They showed me around, and I was kind of disappointed it was just me and them. I was hoping for a host sister or brother. Alana at least had a host brother. She'd already texted me saying that he was a babe and that it didn't matter if they were poor, at least she had eye candy. She said we could all hang out the next day after class, and then I could meet him. At dinner that first night, my host parents kept looking at me, saying I looked like I belonged here, and they asked me if I felt at home. You know what? I did feel at home. The only thing bothering me was the sound of the river nearby. It was so loud, and I started to feel quite anxious. I was so tired after the flight, though, so I needed to sleep. A little while after I'd gone to bed, I heard voices. It must have been my host dad's friend. He sounded drunk, and I could hear him chatting away with my host dad for hours. At some point in the night, I heard my door open. I woke up straight away and realized the drunk man was standing there. I sat upright and asked what he wanted. Then he quickly walked out and said he was just looking for the bathroom. After that, I couldn't sleep. I was so creeped out. The next day was our first day of class, and Alana walked in with a big grin on her face. She winked at me and said that her and her host brother had gotten close last night, and that she hadn't had much sleep. I couldn't believe it. Her trip was way more exciting than mine so far, but at least my boyfriend was coming to visit in a month. After a whole day of classes, I was exhausted, but Alana's host brother Pedro was waiting outside to take us on a tour of the town. I introduced myself, and he wouldn't stop staring at me. I could see Alana was getting uncomfortable. She even hit him on the arm and said, "Why not just take a picture? It'll last longer." And then he laughed and said, "Sorry, she just looks so familiar." It was pretty odd. He kept staring at me the whole afternoon. Eventually, Alana said she was feeling sick and asked to go home, and Pedro dropped her off. Then he said he'd drive me home too because it was too hot to walk. Alana, of course, was not happy about this and gave me an evil glance as she got out. I had to ask him to keep his eyes on the road as he was constantly staring at me. Listen, Pedro, I have a boyfriend. I'm not single, okay? And he laughed and said he wasn't attracted to me. I just looked like someone he used to go to school with. Then he asked about my family, and I said it was just me, and he looked confused. What do you mean, just you? He asked. And I explained I'd spent my whole life in foster homes and didn't have a family. Then he reached out and gave me a hug and said, "We are your family now." Wow, these Mexicans were full on. I mean, I just met this guy today. The next day was my birthday, and I thought maybe Alana and I could do something fun to celebrate. But then Alana arrived at class with her suitcase. I apologized for the day before, thinking she was leaving because she thought Pedro liked me, but it turned out to be much worse. Her mom was sick and she needed to go back to America. I couldn't believe it. We'd only been here one day. I wasn't ready to be here all on my own. After classes finished, Pedro was taking Alana to the airport, and Alana turned to me and said, "Just remember you have a boyfriend, Sarah." Then she left without saying goodbye or happy birthday. Unbelievable. Well, I hoped her mom would be okay at least. I went home and my host parents were waiting with a big cake and balloons, and I was so happy to see them. I assumed it was just the three of us celebrating, but then the creepy drunk man from the day before appeared, and he looked so grumpy. Great, not what I wanted on my birthday. When my host parents started singing happy birthday, he walked out. He was so rude. I looked at my host dad and he just shrugged his shoulders and apologized. He said it was a difficult day for his friend. The rest of the evening, he just stayed outside smoking and looking at the river. It was so... I offered him a piece of cake and he just asked me to leave him alone. When I came back inside, I asked my host parents what his problem was, and they told me his daughter had died years ago and he'd never really recovered. I knew that must have been hard, but I'd lost my whole family and I wasn't going around being mean to people. Why today, of all days? It was my birthday, which meant it was also the day my mom had died, so it wasn't an easy day for me either. After that, I just wanted to be on my own, so I went to bed and called my boyfriend. A little while later, I heard someone singing and I got goosebumps. I knew that song. It was one of my favorite Spanish songs, and I realized it was coming from outside. I peered outside my window and couldn't believe it. It was the grumpy guy singing. I felt kind of bad for how I'd complained about him to my boyfriend, so I went downstairs and told him I liked the song and that he had a nice voice. He was clearly drunk again because he just looked at me. I thought he'd at least say thanks, but I realized he'd been crying, and then he just walked off. I decided to follow him. I was so worried he'd fall in the river or something. "Hey, let me walk with you," I called after him. I then caught up with him and grabbed his arm just before he tripped and fell. There was something about this man that made me curious, especially because of that song. I hadn't listened to it in years because it always made me emotional. I wanted to make him feel better, so I told him today wasn't the best day for me either. I didn't think he was really listening, but I felt like I could connect with this man. We both lost people we loved, and that wasn't easy. We reached the river, and he still hadn't spoken to me. He didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. He just sat down, lit up a cigarette, and then started crying. He was saying something about how she would have been 19 years old today and how it was all his fault. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd been the reason she'd died. And then he told me his son had also left him, that he'd gone to live in another city because he couldn't stand being around his grumpy father. I mean, I couldn't blame the son, but also that's hard. Now he was here all alone, and I definitely know what that feels like. Suddenly, he just got up and walked away, and I decided to sit by the river for a bit. It was really late, but for some reason there were still some kids playing on the other side of the river. Out of nowhere, I felt that tightness in my chest again. Why was this happening? I really felt like I couldn't breathe, so I lay down and tried to take deep breaths. And then it hit me. Another full-on panic attack. I must have passed out because the next moment I was waking up in some kind of hospital bed and my host parents were there holding my hands. The doctor came in and said I'd be okay and that maybe I just fell and knocked my head, but I knew that wasn't what had happened. I just didn't know how to tell him that water made me anxious and gave me panic attacks. It must have been about 2 a.m. by that point, and I told my host parents to go home and get some sleep, but they said no way, they weren't leaving my side. Suddenly, I wondered who'd found me, and they said it was Manuel. "Who's Manuel?" I asked, and they laughed and said, "Our old grumpy friend, didn't he tell you his name?" It dawned on me that I hadn't even bothered to ask his name. I couldn't believe he'd saved me like that. "Where is he?" I asked, and they said he'd been in shock and gone home. He hated hospitals, too many bad memories, and I couldn't argue with that. When I got out of the hospital later that morning, I went home to rest at my host parents', and Manuel was there. He was carrying some flowers, and he apologized for treating me badly. I told him it was okay and thanked him for saving me, and then he asked if I wanted to see photos of his little girl. Before I could even reply, he pulled out an album and started showing me baby photos, and then the last one he ever took of this girl, and it felt like I was about to have another panic attack, except it wasn't because I was anxious. The little girl in the photos was me. I honestly couldn't breathe, and I heard Manuel shouting for my host parents that it was happening again. I couldn't stop crying. It all came back to me. That day at the river, we'd been so poor and the bridge across the river had been destroyed in a flood. Dad cared so much about getting us to school on time that he put us inside these big plastic bags so we wouldn't get wet and carried us across the river. But then, one day, the current had been really strong and I'd been pulled out of my dad's arms. "That's me," I somehow managed to say through my tears. And then I looked at Manuel, really looked at him, and it was him. It was my dad. I knew it. And then I started singing the song he'd been singing the day before, the song he always sang to me and my brother when we couldn't get to sleep at night. The whole time Manuel was just looking at me, and my host parents were suddenly crying too, and I've never seen a grown man cry like that before. He came over to me and started clinging onto me, saying, "It's really you, isn't it? I wanted to believe you were still alive, but this is like a miracle. I can't believe it." That day turned out to be the craziest day of my life. I came to Mexico to work on my Spanish, and now I was being reunited with my dad, who I thought had died. We went to the hospital to do a DNA test to check, and the police were there too. And when we got the result that proved Manuel was my dad, we were jumping around, crying and laughing, and I felt like I was truly at home for the first time in my life. The police filed a report and said that 14 years ago there had been some cases of kidnappings, and that they'd lost track of them once they'd entered America. I was obviously one of those unlucky kids. Probably someone had found me washed up by the river and decided to chance their luck. In the end, I decided to stay in Mexico. My degree could wait, but spending another minute away from my dad couldn't. We had so many years to catch up on. I thought I was an orphan, but actually, I had a father all along. And a brother, too. In fact, the whole town became like family to me, with everyone celebrating the fact that I was alive and well. The police are still trying to figure out what happened all those years ago, and I hope the person gets caught. But for now, I just want to enjoy every moment of being home. I found out my real name is Maria, so I let Sarah go. And my dad gave me my brother's number. Let me tell you, that was an emotional call to make. He's flying home soon, and I cannot wait to see him again. Oh, and Pedro had actually gone to school with me all those years ago. That's why he'd been staring at me. Unfortunately, my boyfriend broke up with me when he found out I wasn't coming back. But hey, Pedro's single.
Hello, my name is Emily. I'm much like you in many ways, perhaps. I have a normal suburban house. I have 2 parents that love me. I go to high school and I love animals. But one thing in my life is possibly nothing like anything you've ever experienced. My sister Amy. Amy was not normal. She never had been. She held a burning hatred for me from the moment I was born. My parents told me she once tried to put me into a washing machine and turn it on to see if it would hurt me. She called it an experiment. Thankfully, my parents intercepted her cruel antics and began to distance her from me since then. Amy was cruel and scary, even to my parents. Growing up, I could see how they fawned over me and cherished me, while they would always walk on eggshells around Amy, terrified of accidentally sending her into one of her angry fits. I once brought a little puppy home from the street and Amy became utterly enraged to see him there. She screamed at the top of her voice about how her parents had denied her a dog for years and how unfair it was that they were allowing me to keep one. I told her we could share the puppy together. I was young, and I hoped that she would love me. I had no idea what she truly was. We kept the puppy, Terrence, together. Amy, however, wouldn't let me play with him or even come near him. Even if I cried and cried, Amy would simply laugh cruelly from the other side of the locked door while little Terrence would bark on. It was torture. One day when Amy was in school, I broke the lock of her room and stole Terrence. I just wanted to play with him for a little while. He seemed so excited to be out of that cramped room too, his little tail wagging all around. So I happily went to our backyard with him and a frisbee. I found his tracks leading away into the forest behind our house, but they went all the way into the dangerous, dark areas. I was forbidden from going in there. Dejected, I came home and told Amy and my parents that I lost Terrence. That's when true hell was unleashed on me. Amy lost her mind. She began to wail loudly, uncontrollably. She screamed at me for breaking into her room and attacked me, trying to yank on my hair. My father pulled her back before she could reach me, and Amy swore that she was going to get me back for doing this to her. I cried and swore up and down that I didn't mean to lose Terrence. I loved him too, to make her suffer. She told me that now she would make me suffer. I had no way to know how much she meant those words. I'm not a cruel person, so I had no way to understand how much she truly wanted me to ache. She hid under my bed one night, waiting for me to slip under the covers. Then, when I was resting in my bed, she grabbed my ankles and let out a horrific screech, yanking me off the bed. I was so terrified my heart nearly leapt out of my throat. I cried for my parents as I crashed on the floor. Amy stood up and laughed at me, walking away with a pompous bounce. Weeks after that day, I went on a date with Henry Hills, the cutest boy in our school. I was so excited about this. I could barely stand it. He took me out for dinner and ice cream, and then I brought him home to meet my family. When I took him to my room, however, the sight before him made him scream. All of my dolls were hung by noose around their neck. They swung side to side from the ropes attached to the rafters, like so many bodies. Henry Hills ran out of my room. He never spoke to me again since that day. The reports of my house of horrors spread like wildfire, and no one from school would come to my house anymore. They were all terrified of Amy. How could she do this? What the hell was wrong with Amy? I knew she was sick, but this was getting out of hand. What I didn't know was that she was just getting started. She snuck into my room the night before the spring dance at school. She climbed in through the window with a pair of scissors.